Good Sunday morning. Welcome to our study for today as we continue to explore Islam. The intention of providing you as believers in Christ with a basis for communication with Muslim neighbors whom you love, as we are taught to love our neighbors. And you will have an opportunity, perhaps better by understanding Islam, to have a productive and an intelligent conversation with them. We looked last week at several questions, answering them about Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. What we're going to do today is to see how Islam expanded in a unified empire and how it made contributions to world civilization. We need to know that. So I hope that this is informative to you, and in the long run is a blessing to you. Certainly hope that God receives the glory for it. Let's join our study for it this morning as we explore Islam. Last week, we looked at some and attempted to answer some questions submitted by Austin Carter. First of all, who was Muhammad? He was a teacher of ethics in Mecca. He became a religious and political and military leader. The sources are difficult to be sure. They are late. How did he become the prophet? A very slow process as he interacted with Christians and Jews and became convinced that he had a divine mission. What did he do, including rising to heaven? Well, he did much for Mecca. He created a state from the Meccan tribal society. He gave them a set of morals and a religious standard. There were Jews in Yathrib in Mecca when he went there. He hoped to work with them, but they rejected him, and he then began to form his own religion. He reconquered Mecca, cleansed the sacred Kaaba, and established himself there. The idea of rising to heaven was supplied by his followers after his death to give him greater credibility. Why did the Arabic people believe him? Well, he was a persuasive teacher. He gave people an identity and a purpose, and people need a purpose. He gave them a better standard of living. And after gaining power, they were given the choice of either accepting his teaching, paying a tax, the jizya, or death. The original basic tenets, well, there was the 5 pillars: faith in one God and Muhammad as his prophet, prayer 5 times a day facing Mecca, almsgiving, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and the Hajj, the pilgrimage once in a lifetime to Mecca. How are they different today? They're not. Although other doctrines, other teachings, other interpretations have been added. Was Islam originally Islam versus the Jews? Well, Muhammad originally thought the Jews would join with him because he, Muhammad, believed the scriptures, but they rejected him as a false prophet, and that meant animosity. Now, the idea of a state was a process that grew as he reconquered Mecca and from there other territories. Who wrote the Quran? Muhammad claimed that he received revelations from Gabriel. He recited the revelations, that's what Quran means, recital. He recited them to scribes who wrote them on a variety of items. They were then collected later by Zayd ibn Thabat, his personal scribe, and written by Abu Bakr, his good friend, and edited by Caliph Uthman. How and why did Islam become both a state, country, and religion? Well, again, that's a process. It's a matter of growing by just doing and experimenting, because they didn't have a template or a plan ahead of them. So when Muhammad came to control in Yathrib and then went back to Mecca and defeated the Meccan army, you have the beginning of necessity of a state. It was later truly organized under Caliph Uthman, and Abd al-Malik also contributed. Is all of Islamic law in the Quran, or has it been developed separately over the years? Well, in addition to the Quran is the Hadith, which was collected by Muhammad al-Bukhari, published in 870, and then the Sirah, made up of tafsir, which are commentaries on the hadith, and taqlid, the histories of all humanity to the time of Muhammad. Those three sources, and the basis of those three sources is Sharia, or Islamic law, is formed. Now, there are other questions that we're going to look at today, and I hope we can answer these questions over the course of the next few minutes. The empire of Islam after the death of Muhammad was a united state, a united country. And this will be the only time in the history of Islam that there is a complete unity in the movement. There are three caliphates known as Orthodox, Umayyad, and Abbasid. And they follow Muhammad because caliph means successor. In all three of these, there is unity. There is one empire, but that empire evolves, that empire changes as we move from the Orthodox to the Abbasid, and gradually it becomes more and more, let us say, oriental, more and more oriented toward the Greek world, and more intellectual and less militaristic. As a matter of fact, the first two caliphates are going to be the caliphates of expansion geographically. The Abbasid Caliphate is going to focus on academics. We'll see that in a moment. First of all, the Orthodox Caliphate, known as Rashidun, or the enlightened ones, or the Orthodox ones. Abu Bakr was one of Muhammad's first converts and a good friend of his who went with Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. After Muhammad died, he became the successor, the caliph, and ruled for 2 years. He attempted to hold the state together and also to convert the Bedouins, the nomadic people living in the desert of Arabia. Now, they resented the rise of Islam. They were very much against it. It was a threat to their way of life. They were very good at raiding, but not so good at worship. So the decision was made to give them a place in the society. They were made the warriors who would fight in Syria and in Palestine, where there were no effective forces. And thus they had a purpose. Now, after Abu Bakr, Omar becomes the caliph and rules for 634 to 644. Now, these early caliphs were not sure of their role. Again, I want to say that this is a process that develops sort of ad hoc as they see the need for it. But in 636, they were surprised, as was the Byzantine army, by a significant defeat of the Byzantines at Yarmouk near Jerusalem. And it is at this point that Islam becomes a force to be reckoned with and becomes a significant state. What had happened? For many, many years, the Romans had fought against the Persians. As a matter of fact, Romans had never conquered Persia. And the Emperor Heraclius, who was very competent, took it upon himself to do that. And there was this long, protracted campaign. And in 620, finally, Heraclius, with the army worn out, and with him particularly sick and worn out, yet they defeated the Persians, and Heraclius struggled to carry a huge cross back to Constantinople and to Hagia Sophia. Now, in this case, they are successful, but since they are so weakened by this long conflict, that may account for the fact that this fresh Islamic army is able to defeat the Byzantine army at Yarmouk. And then 2 years later, in 638, Jerusalem fell. The city of Jerusalem fell to the Muslims, and it was proclaimed to be Islam's third holy city: Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem. 639, they swept into Egypt, but you see that took until 642. Here's the map showing the Battle of Yarmouk. Now we have two empires, the Islamic Empire, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine leaders at first never imagined that the Arabs would be a threat. It was far from their concept. They thought they were heretical Christians who needed to be taught, and they sent them missionaries. But by 661, when they lost a fleet to them, they were convinced that they were indeed a threat. By 680, they considered them fiends of hell. Now, any political system takes time to be acknowledged as a new force. The Byzantines laughed at them at first, but they stopped laughing by 680. And the interesting thing is, though they remained enemies, they later would trade with each other because both of these empires were dependent upon trade. And so they kept the trade lines open. And Omar, the caliph, decided to appoint a council to select his successor. That's also a development. Now, the two candidates to succeed Omar were Othman and Ali. Othman was selected, but some felt that Ali was the best candidate. And you see a division here in Islam. It's not so united at this point. Omar was assassinated, and that brought Othman to the throne. Now, this, and we saw the question a moment ago, what about the Sunni and the Shia, the two major divisions of Islam? Right here are the seeds of division between the Sunni and the Shia. Those who believe that Ali was the best candidate will become the Shia. Those who believe that Othman was the best candidate would become the Sunni. Sunni means majority. Othman ruled between 644 and 656 and expanded the empire, pushed into North Africa, into Europe. And by 655, they were a real threat to the Byzantine Empire. And of course, you know that Byzantium is indeed Rome, simply moved to the east. They defeated a Byzantine fleet again in 652 and in 655. And Othman continued to be opposed by Ali. Ali had married Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, and thus there was this dissension. These followers will rebel against Othman. We have an internal struggle, but Othman holds on to power. And yet the office of caliph is now no longer sacred because it's been challenged, and now there are divisions over it. And a fatal secret emerges that armies can make caliphs and unmake caliphs. So we have internal chaos in the Islamic State. But then Ali becomes the caliph in 656, rules to 661, but he comes to power with blood on his hands because Othman is murdered. And for the next several years, until 671, there's civil war in the Islamic State. And continually, Othman's followers oppose Ali, and you see this break. They become more and more separate. And of course, Ali is the son-in-law of Muhammad. That gave him credibility. So the idea began with, particularly with these people who become the Shia, that caliphs must be related to the Prophet. So that leads to the end of what we call the Rashidun and the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, which is 661 to 750. And the first caliph in the Umayyad Caliphate is Muawiyah from 661 to 680. And Muawiyah was a very capable caliph. He moved the capital. This is a smart move. He moved the capital from Mecca to Damascus. Now, you know that Damascus is in Syria. You know that it was a Christian territory and has a great Christian history by this time. And he takes over that area and makes Damascus the capital, meaning that it is moving toward more, let us say, sophisticated areas. He was a capable and wise sovereign, even laid siege to Constantinople. That's a daring move. And yet the Byzantines were able to survive for another 800 years because they developed a secret weapon known as Greek fire. And the recipe was always secret. The Muslims never got it. And thus we have the longest period of peace during this Umayyad Caliphate. They will use bribes to maintain peace on the frontier. It is to their advantage to have peace with the Byzantine Empire. They also will use the jihad to control the Bedouins. Jihad was holy war, and the Bedouins were sent out on raids to keep them occupied. Now, here's the only illustration that's ever been found of Greek fire. It comes from a Byzantine painting. And you see that the Byzantine soldiers in the boat to the left are firing a siphon gun to these Muslim sailors on the boat on the right. And it's an awesome thing, because when the ingredients, the Greek fire, come out of the siphon gun, we don't know what they were. Some people say naphtha, saltpeter, lime, but it came out as a blob. And when it struck something, anything that it struck, it caused it to ignite, to be on fire. And it could be as well catapulted over the wall of a city. And again, the same effect that it's going to set anything on fire that it strikes. So with this awesome weapon, the Byzantines were able to fend off the Muslims until the time of gunpowder. Now, Muslims become increasingly Hellenized. That is, they begin to appropriate the cultural values of the Greek world. And they lean now on traditions of Rome and Greece and Byzantium, which means they become more cosmopolitan, more sophisticated. They're moving away from Arabia and the desert. And the Sunnis and the Shias continue to oppose each other, which they do today. They're the two leading forces of dissent. The Sunnis, that word means majority, they accepted the Umayyad Caliphate. They also accepted the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. They were the majority, and they were orthodox. The Shiites, on the other hand, denied the validity of Umayyad rule. And they denied the position of the Sunni, as they still do today. They believe that the Hadith should not be accepted. In talking to people who are Shiites, they say they have their own Hadith, their own sayings of the Prophet, and they certainly do not accept the Sirah, the interpretations, the commentaries on the Hadith. The Shiites, many believe Ali not only should have been the selection of the last caliph, but they believe that he was the first caliph. And they believe that caliphs must be related to the Prophet. Of course, Ali was by being the son-in-law. In a way, they're similar to the Protestants in Christianity who object to the majority Catholics. The Shiites broke into fragments. They could not agree among themselves. Now, as far as the Umayyad Caliphate is concerned, there were 13 caliphs who followed Muawiyah. And the Umayyad period is the one that provides the greatest growth. That and the Rashidun, the first two caliphs, we can see the greatest expansion geographically of this empire. And as we go along, the Arab element decreases and the non-Arab element grows. And the idea of a state, remember, that's one of the leading questions of this study, is what about it being a state, a country? This idea of mulk, or state, begins to grow, it begins to develop, because in Arabia, there was nothing greater than the tribe, but now that concept is replaced with the idea of a state. And the Umayyads are dealing with and solving great problems, and doing so rather capably. Now, the chronicles, the histories we have, are often composed by their enemies, and they give us a rather jaundiced view. And yet, in spite of that, we can see how the Umayyads have been capable in their governing. And the caliph now becomes equivalent to a medieval king. Now, the Umayyad state, they divided into vice royalties. One of the questions we had was, what about hierarchy? We begin to see that developing in the Umayyad period. Always, when a land was conquered, 1/5 of that land was given to the state and to the treasury of the state. And remember, there is no separation, at least at this point, between religion and state. It is a theocracy. They developed a chancery to issue documents, and they adopted the models of the Byzantine army. They're very good at adopting and bringing over ideas and procedures from the Christian world, as well as from the Jewish world. And yet they contribute the Arabic language. They took their language wherever they went throughout their domains. By 658, they had taken Iraq in Mesopotamia. By 670, they had made Syria a part of the state. And Islam, therefore, became a multinational empire united by a single language, that being Arabic. And thus, now we see that the three major languages of the Middle Ages will be Latin, Greek, and Arabic. A big advance was the conquest of Spain in 711. Spain became a part of the empire. It was invaded by a Berber from North Africa by the name of Tariq. And as he approached Spain, he saw this rock, this mountain. He named it for himself, Jib al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Of course, we call that Gibraltar. And here you see a map showing the expansion of Islam. The purple area is what was controlled by the Islamic Empire at the death of Muhammad in 632. The rather gray areas that you see, or light green, would be after the conquest of the first four caliphs by 661. And then the Umayyads will add to the territory, and that's the territory that you see in green. And thus it becomes a huge empire at this point. And the Byzantine Empire has shrunk. It has lost these territories. All except the far west were a part of the Byzantine Empire. Now, as far as Spain is concerned, Tariq met very little resistance from Roderick, the Visigothic king. The Germans controlled Spain at this time. I should explain that when Rome fell in the west, Germanic tribes took over the empire in the west. Different Germanic tribes took over different parts of the Roman Empire. And the Visigoths took Spain, and they were not popular. So the Muslims pushed into the interior, and more cities fell to him. Musa, a Muslim general in North Africa who was jealous of Tariq, replaced him and continued the conquest with great success. And you see here the conquest of Spain. North Africa is in the south, but they will continue all the way up to the Pyrenees. The original inhabitants of Spain were called Iberians, but prior to the Romans, the Celtic people conquered much of Europe, and the people then living in Spain were known as Celt-Iberians. When the Visigoths, the Germans, came in, they hated them. The Jews were dissatisfied with Visigothic rule because the Visigoths were intolerant of the Jews. So that means that both Jews and Spanish people welcomed the Muslims, and they were allowed to maintain their faith. Remember, Jews and Christians are dhimmi, the people of the book. But they were required, as all of the dhimmi were, to pay the jizya, or the tax. The Muslims then headed north into France and overran Aquitaine and Bordeaux. And by 732, they were as far as Poitiers. However, the Duke of France, we say he's very much like a prime minister. He was called the major domo, or the mayor of the palace. He was not a king. But Charles Martel, with his army, turned them back at Tours, and that stopped their advance into France. And then they withdrew from central France. And that helped Martel build up his prestige, so that his son, Pepin, became king. And his grandson, Pepin's son, was the great Charlemagne, who built a huge empire in the West. But this was not the most important battle. As great as it seems, the really important battle was on the Eastern Front, because the strength was in Byzantium, and that was the victory of the Byzantine Emperor Leo III in 718. He defeated the great weight of the Islamic forces, both by land and sea, and did so quite decisively. And that weakened the Umayyad regime and allowed Abbas al-Safa to come to power. That's Abbas, or Abi the bloodshedder, because he came to power with blood on his hands. The non-Arab people were supportive of the Abbasids, the followers of Abbas, because of the fact that the Arabs had been very discriminatory, and the non-Arab people resented their attitude toward minorities. And so we have a racial situation creating dissidence within the Islamic Empire. And now at this point, the non-Arab people are going to support the Abbasids, even though the Abbasids are themselves ethnically Arab. But the Abbasids promised a religious state not based on racial lines. At this point, the caliphs, moving away from the Arabian influence, become more Persian and more Oriental. In 750, the Battle of Zab, Abbas eliminated his rivals militarily. But there were still the Umayyad princes who technically were in control. So Abbas simply invited all the Umayyad princes to a banquet. He called it a peace banquet. We're going to make peace now. You know, he made peace. He murdered them. When they got in and sat down to eat, he exterminated all of them. However, one prince, the governor of Spain, arrived late. And here's one time when it was a good thing to be late to a banquet. He escaped. He saw what was happening. He turned and ran and went back to Spain and created his own dynasty in Spain, which is known as the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, which is between 750 and 1031. While the rest of the Near East will be dominated by the Abbasids. The Abbasid Caliphate is different. It is the dynasty that witnessed great cultural development in Islam. As I said, they are not so oriented toward expansion, although there's some battles, but rather than put the emphasis on military action, they put the emphasis on culture. The Abbasids break down the traditional distinctions between Arab and Muslim. Remember, the Arabs are Islamic people from Arabia, the Muslims are non-Arab Muslims. And yet the Arabic element triumphed in the culture, in the context of a theocratic state. And that resulted in a very complex political system. But Islam is further urbanized, and its orientation is toward cities. And now we see the development of judges, divans, and tax collectors. The state, remember, receives 1/5 of the booty. And now the addition of, in the hierarchy as it develops, vice caliphs or wazirs. They are advisors to caliphs, administrators, and they often challenge the authority of the caliph and became rivals of the caliph. They also, we'll see the development of the imam. He's the man in charge of daily prayers, still is. He's a priest in the context of Islam. And then Qadi, although this is a very early office, it was offered to Muhammad in Yathrib, that's a religious and political judge, making the Islamic system work and keeping the religion and the politics together. The Abbasid caliphs were more despotic. They called themselves the shadow of God on earth, sometimes Al-Mahdi, the guided ones, or Al-Rashid, the orthodox ruler. They also built a new capital. They moved the capital, which had been at Damascus, now to a third location. The third caliphate capital is going to be in Baghdad, but they built a new city just as the Romans had built the city of Constantinople. At this point, Islam lost its desert characteristics. It became more Persian. The person who built Baghdad was al-Mansur. At this point, the Muslim empire is relying more and more on the Persian cataphracti, because remember, they had conquered by this time Persia, and the cataphracti were the cavalry. They relied less on the Bedouins. They withdrew to Arabia, disgusted with the development of the state, and they became a disruptive force. And oftentimes Baghdad was forced to send out forces to chastise the Bedouins. Here on the left, you see a painting of a 9th century Abbasid caliph in Baghdad. And on the right, the 9th century palace of the caliphs in Baghdad, which apparently is still standing. Now, physically, the Arab element was replaced as it moved into the Greek territories and Roman territories. But physically, though it was supplanted, it never was spiritually. The motivation was still Arabian. The Abbasids, as I mentioned, were Arabs, but culturally, they were more Eastern. And so as a result of this synthesis, a medieval Near East world arose. And by 750, Muslims will dominate the Mediterranean and the coastal areas of Asia Minor. And they broke down the old ancient patterns of life. There were 37 caliphs in the Abbasid Caliphate. And they made so certain that all people became a part of the system in some way and felt that they belonged. Now, Hellenism, the culture of Greece, became dominant. And thus it resulted in the golden age of Islamic culture in a time of great thinkers. All was centered in this great and glorious city of Baghdad, which means gift of God. It was a city without equal, except for Constantinople, these two great cities. In Baghdad, a Near East culture and pattern of life emerged. You find as you walk through the city, apartments built close together. You find a trade going on. There are schools, madrasas. There are baths, very much like the Romans had baths. It's a center for Islamic trade and for the way of life. There's uniformity in religion that was lacking in the ancient period. The most famous Abbasid ruler was Harun al-Rashid, or Harun the Orthodox, 786 to 809. And this was a period of great vitality and enthusiasm. He was a very good military commander and could either make peace or destroy his enemy. He had the power to do either. And he dealt with Charlemagne, but he dealt with him as an equal. He considered him an equal. He sent him an elephant and a clock. And you see a sophistication in Islam that's even lacking in France. Harun al-Rashid fought against Huns. He fought against the Byzantines, but he was a very pious man who prostrated himself 100 times a day. He went to Mecca several times, kept 4 wives, that's the maximum, and a harem. At times he was cruel and treacherous, but he provided a great stimulus to science and art, and drew philosophers to Baghdad. He was very tolerant of Christian thinkers and physicians. He allowed them to live there. He allowed them to operate in the state and make contributions to it. He was the confidant of scholars and of kings. Yahya Barmaki was Harun's wazir. He will use state funds to build up personal forces and become a threat to Harun, who had him executed. And that's an example of, by the way, of delegated authority and hierarchy within this theocratic state. Byzantium was forced to pay tribute to Harun when they realized they could not defeat him. Mutasim, 833 to 842, created a personal bodyguard of 4,000 Turkish mercenaries. This is the first time we see Turks. They have come now from the steppes of Central Asia and moved into the Islamic Empire. They are very good warriors. And so Mutasim, the caliph, employed them as his personal bodyguard. They began to antagonize the people of Baghdad with their customs and with their haughty attitude. And people rose in revolt against Mutasim because he had used them as bodyguard. And they drove out the bodyguard, these Turks, and they drove out Mutasim and held him prisoner in Samaria. The result was chaos in the Islamic State, an internal civil war that lasted to 892. The unity is now broken down. The empire is controlled by eunuchs and by others. In 869, 500,000 people were slain in a slave uprising. But in 1037, another group of Turks, the Seljuk Turks, moved into the area, brought order, restored the caliph to Baghdad, and they brought with them their office of sultan, meaning one with authority. They take over the administrative responsibility. They become the regent for the land ruled by the caliph. They become the manager. The first sultan is to grow big. And by 1055, the caliph is only a figurehead. And the Abbasid Caliphate is no longer important. The authority of the caliph is broken down. The unity that we have seen with Islam to this point is ended. But the economy continues. The economy of Islam flourished, even while there was political chaos. Muhammad, remember, had encouraged economic activity. He asked his followers to protect merchants. And by the 8th century, Muslims controlled all of the Near East markets. And remember, they traded with Byzantium even while they were at war with Byzantium, because both empires needed trade, and there was never an economic boycott. They brought the Arabic language everywhere, and that made communication easier and helped and facilitated trade, because Arabic is phonetic. It's suited to clear thinking and poetic expression. It contains depth and vitality. Now, the non-Arabic people will write in Arabic. Even Christians. They, of course, had conquered Spain, but they allowed the church to continue in Spain, but they used Arabic in their services, and that's known as the Mozarab rite. Our words, by the way, beginning with al, like alcohol, derive from Arabic. Remember, the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of the faith, the pilgrimage to Mecca. As the Hajj continues, that is a factor that lessens conflict because it promotes unity and cohesion among all Islamic people. But the Islamic Empire now is involved with 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. The city is important because it's an urban civilization and predicated upon the city. They always thought in terms of city. And that's even in the West, where Cordoba, the great city in Spain, became a tremendous city. Over 3,000 mosques, 300 baths, 100,000 residents, lighted streets, paved streets, parks, cherry trees, peach trees, orange trees, lemon trees, sugar and spices brought by Arabs. It is still a beautiful city, and you still see a lot of orange trees. This is the great mosque of Cordoba. This is a good example of the glory of Islamic architecture and the glory of the city of Cordoba. They built this mosque originally in the 8th century when they conquered Spain, but added onto it in the 9th and 10th centuries, and each edition was even more glorious than the one before. This is quite an exceptional experience to see this mosque. Intellectually, of course, in the early period, the important thing was to be a theologian, but by the 8th century, they began to argue that secular subjects should also be studied. Even though the state is promoting piety, radical piety, yet they're willing to study other subjects. Ethical histories were written that described the people with whom they dealt. They kept a record. They made enormous contributions in medicine, continuing the practices of the Greeks, while the West is dealing with holy water. They studied anatomy, and their medicine was widely used in the West. They were weak only in the field of surgery. They created the tradition of experimentation. Now, Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi, or Razis, was a Persian born near Tehran and one of the first great Muslim physicians. He gave away his money and he died in poverty, but he made great contributions even as a philosopher. He wrote over 200 works. He didn't begin to study medicine until he was 40 years of age. His works translated into Latin weigh 221 pounds. Thus, he was a prodigious scholar. His works in Latin became the basis for study in Western universities. Here's a picture of Razis. He gave the first clinical description of smallpox. He dealt with children's diseases. And he planned a hospital in Baghdad. Very interesting where he selected the site. He focused on hygiene. And so he placed strips of meat all over the city of Baghdad and went back periodically to check and see where the fewest flies had accumulated. And then he decided that spot would be the healthiest place to build a hospital. He once quarreled with the caliph, who hit him in the head with a book and impaired his hearing, yet he went on to do great things. He decided that preventative medicine was the best. Then Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, followed Razis. He was born in Romania, near Bucura. And he wrote the Canon of Medicine, which was a textbook used in medical schools in the West. A universal scholar, a child protege. He knew the Quran at age 10. At 18, he was the court physician to the caliph. He was a mathematician, as well as a doctor, a philosopher, a geographer, a physicist, a lawyer. Philosophy took the form of syllogistic thought, which is quite valid in logic, and there was developed a good deal of skepticism by the 8th century. And Muslim philosophers even wondered about Muhammad. Some even charged that he corrupted the truth. Many Islamic scholars at this point began to turn to science, which caused the more conservative Arabs later to use the word philosopher as one who corrupts the truth. Now, we should note, where there is intolerance, it always enters when the state is in a condition of decay. The government is failing. That is when they become intolerant. And when we see such things as taqiyya, that is the provision that lying for the good of Islam is permitted and encouraged. If you see that telling the truth is detrimental to the cause of Islam, then you are free to lie, taqiyya. We see translators. Hunayn ibn Ishaq was one of the greatest. He was a bibliophile, a lover of books. He introduced the ideas of Galen. Most Islamic medicine is based on his translation of the works of Galen, the Roman physician. Probably he was a Christian and was tolerated and subsidized by the state for his ability. Then there were commentators. It was a great period of the commentary because Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, became the paragon of virtue for early Islam. Aristotle shaped the way that they saw the physical world. And the Muslims were convinced that Aristotle was always right. And after studying him, some of them began to wonder about the Quran. And they had a problem of reconciliation of Aristotle to the Quran, as Christians had a problem of reconciling Aristotle to the Bible. It was a time of tremendous energy. The great translator and commentator of Aristotle was Averroes. He was born in 1126 in Cordoba. His real name is Ibn Rushd. In geography, they made great contributions. Merchants would keep notebooks when they traded with other people, and those notebooks became a source of geography. They also became famous for cartography, to making maps. In mathematics, they developed forms of algebra, trigonometry, and arithmetic. One of the Muslim traders went to India to trade, and he brought back the Hindu numerals, which were adapted as Arabic numerals. So our Arabic numerals originated in India. As a result of trade, they come to us, and they developed the concept of zero. And Khwarizmi developed algebra and arithmetic. That is his picture you see to the right. In terms of history, the biography of the Prophet by Ibn Ishaq in the 8th century, we talked about him last week, and then other biographical dictionaries were produced, the chronicles, and the best known historian was Ibn Khaldun in the 14th, early 15th century. You see his picture to the right. So you see, they were what we call polymaths. They produced the greatest scholars in 4 or 5 different areas, and scholars were expected to be, and often were, experts in all of these different fields. Islamic learning came to be respected and used in the West at this time. Again, I will say, intolerance comes in at the point, and only at the point, as the state begins to decline. You see the picture here to the right of Umar Khayyam, who was a poet and mathematician. So the polymaths, Al-Kindi, a good example, the greatest example of a polymath, and he's the only Arab of the desert among these scholars. He died in 865. He was an expert in optics, chemistry, medicine, music, philosophy, He blended Plato and Aristotle with theology. And also Al-Farabi, who died in 950, who blended Plato and Aristotle with Sufi thought. And just a word about Sufis. Sufis are the mystics. All religions tend to have mystics, and they're a class among themselves. And oftentimes Muslims did not know what to do with the Sufis because they just had their own rules. Now, in accomplishments, they built asylums and hospitals while the West was dealing in primitive fashion with the mentally ill. They were dealing with optics scientifically. They built astronomical observatories. For instance, at Cairo and other cities, they became famous for observation. Now, that is not the truth today. These great and wonderful accomplishments in the field of culture, in the field of science, in the field of literature and philosophy, those are not the case today because something has changed, something is different. The Islamic State in its unity came to an end after the Abbasid Caliphate and will divide up into three different Islamic empires, two of which are not expansive in their goals. One is, and that's the Ottoman Empire. We'll turn next week to that. We want to understand these things because as we talk with our Muslim friends and neighbors, it is important to understand where they were, what they contributed, to understand the good as well as the dangers. Remember, we started with the thesis that we have dangers to be aware of, terrorists and things like that, intolerance that we find today, but as well, there are opportunities because Muslims often are looking for truth. They always have been, really, and they have been willing to investigate different things. So they will be receptive if we have the basis for communication. Thank you for being a part of our class today, and I certainly pray that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit will be with you all.